So I had the wonderful, wonderful honor of getting access to this book, Rise to the Challenge by Marlene Johnson, a memoir of politics, leadership, and love. And for colleagues who are joining us, let me just give you one advice. You have got to get this book. And she didn't pay me. She didn't pay me for
I
this.
didn't pay you, but I'm going to take you with me everywhere. So,
Absolutely. You have to get this book. And there are lots of reasons why I'm saying this, and you're going to get a good sense of it in just a few. It is my absolute honor and really just a joy to welcome Marlene Johnson for a segment of IE30 today. For those of you who know Marlene, you know Marlene as a former CEO, the longest serving CEO, I would say, of NAFSA. She literally served NAFSA in incredible ways for close to 2 decades and has left an incredible legacy. There's so many times when, I'm looking at a document and of course Marlene's name will come up. And you're going to learn in just a few, just the rich legacy that she's left at NAFSA and that we continue to benefit from as a field. But also, many of you who've known Marlene knows that she's had an incredible past before coming to NAFSA, in that she was a lieutenant governor of Minnesota. And we're going to have to talk about Minnesota. There has to be something about Minnesota and politics that you're going to have to fill me in, but we're going to get to that as well. And she also has been really a business person, an entrepreneur, someone also who I would say really has done a lot of community organizing and has been a champion for decades for women and for marginalized communities in making sure that they have a voice and a seat at the table. And we're going to talk about all of that today. But I have to first start with this question to you, Marlene. What made you decide to write this book at this time?
yes. Well, the first reason is that after I had been keeping a journal for my whole life since my early 20s. I'd kept a journal every day. I'd been writing, and then when I became lieutenant governor, I started to keep a second journal, which was a working journal about my life, because I was the first woman lieutenant governor in Minnesota. There were, I think, 6 or 7 women elected lieutenant governor in the whole country that year in 1982. And so I had a sense of making history. And in addition to that, I was taking on a defined role in the administration, which had not been done for any lieutenant governor before me. So I had a real sense of the history, the importance of history in what I was doing. So I wanted to document that. And those documents, those journals are with the Historical Society archives now. And then during my time here at NAFSA, we were doing some pretty special things, I think. And then late in my time here, my husband suffered an injury that required a lifetime of living in a nursing home with a serious brain injury, and life changed a lot for me. And after he died, and I shared that news with a friend, she said to me, "You have to write this story."
Mm.
And I kept that thought in my head for several months. And I finally sat down one day and just wrote about those last 5 to 10 years with Peter. Had 50 pages, and I showed them to her. And this is my friend Pauline Boss. And she said, "Well, you're a good writer and you've got many really wonderful stories here, but you need to tell your whole story for this to make sense to the reader." So I took a deep breath and said, "Well, okay, let me try." So another good friend, and this one, NAFSA, Betty Sapelsa, kind of helped me with this early slog. And if I fed her lunch, she would come by and help me, chart out what the next chapters would be and give me feedback and things like that. So for the next year and a half, I wrote something 6 days a week. And I had close to 300 pages, and I started looking for a publisher, and finally found somebody willing to talk to me, although they wouldn't commit to the publishing part. But he did work with me until I did a rewrite, and he was satisfied with it, and finally said, "Okay, I'm willing to recommend that we publish this at the University of Minnesota Press." So it's been a fantastic journey, and I've enjoyed it a lot.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for telling your story, because I think it's a story that not only will inspire a lot of people, but I also suspect that it will give courage to many others to be willing, particularly those who have journals,
Yes.
to be willing to kind of take, sort of pen to paper, and write their stories. So we're grateful that you
Thank you.
went that extra mile and you put it down on paper and that you can share it with so many of us.
Yeah.
Because
Thank
also the topics that you're really touching on your book is something that people deeply care about. Everyone wants to learn much more about effective leadership. Folks wants to learn much more, particularly in this environment, about politics and how to do good politics for the greater good.
you. Right.
So those are things that people care about, and we're going to have a minute to also talk about the love of your life, because I
Yes.
think that's an important part of the story here, and so we want to make sure we do that. So, I mean, all in all, and I think you do a really good job of chronicling this in your book. You've had an incredibly successful life in politics, business, international education, and so many other parts of it. And so, help us understand what have been some of the most important lessons that you can share about leadership? Because you've been a leader in so many different domain areas. What are the most important lessons that you think would be helpful for us to understand?
Well, thank you for that question, Fanta, because I think one of the things that became clearer to me as I wrote the book, I've always understood, well, for a long time, I've understood that from the time I was lieutenant governor, I was actively learning how to influence from a position that had no authority.
Mm,
There is nobody who is that much interested in the lieutenant governor. It has no constitutional authority. And so, to the extent that I could make things happen, it had to be through persuasion and influence and helping frame issues in ways that people could get interested in. And I think that I did that quite well in my 8 years as lieutenant governor. But I kept learning more and more all the time to take advantage of opportunities even though I had no authority.
mm,
And then, of course, at NAFSA, I had some authority. But then, when I was in the caregiving role with Peter at the nursing home, I realized that again, I was using leadership, but
mm.
I had no power there. Other people were in charge of his care, and there were dozens of people who were involved in his care. And I was only a member of his team, and I had to nurture those relationships with the staff as much as look out for my own personal caregiving of Peter. If I wanted things to go really well for him and I wanted them to try new things and to change or expand the exposures they were giving him, I had to influence them from a position of a family member.
Mm,
So what it became very clear to me as I wrote the book and it was that the thread for all these things is leadership, and that for all of us we can exert leadership from wherever we sit. Sometimes we will sit in the job that you now have, that I used to have. Sometimes we will sit in a job as a family support system in a caregiving situation, and sometimes we will have a job like a lieutenant governor or a different job that doesn't have any real authority, but that has many opportunities for influence. And so it really is an important mindset for all of us that we understand that about ourselves and accept that opportunity as well as the responsibility of that.
wow. So, this is a really interesting perspective. This piece about exerting leadership when you don't have authority, and what that looks like. Where did you learn that? How did you learn that?
I think I learned it on the job as
Mm,
lieutenant governor. Because it was very clear to me immediately that I had no authority. And that because I was the first lieutenant governor in the state's history that had ever had a governor who was interested in having me being an active participant, the whole system was getting used to me even showing up. As I say in the book, one of the first things the governor said to me was, "You are welcome in my office for any meeting I have, unless we specifically say you can't for some confidential reasons." So I would say 95% of the meetings, if I wanted to be in them, I could. I didn't go to that many, but I went to many. And I was involved in every budget discussion, and those were things that had not been done before. So there was often, not always, but often there was tension because people were saying, what is she messing around in my playpen for,
Mhm.
my sandbox? And other times I was just ignored, and so I had to learn how to, uh, I wanted to have impact. I took that opportunity seriously. I felt like I was there. I was being paid by the taxpayers, and I had an obligation to earn my keep. And so I found ways, and I was very fortunate to be in a situation with the governor who gave me specific assignments. So that helped raise my confidence and my view that I really should do things that served the agenda of the administration.
Mhm. And in reading the book, the common thread that I saw is you mentioned the numerous occasions where leadership was called for was also this importance of vision
Yes.
and discipline in execution. I could really pick up in the book a recurrent theme around vision and discipline for execution that really showed throughout the book, I have to say.
Yes, and I think to that point, one of the things you mentioned earlier was the commitment to expanding the role of women and other people
Yes.
from marginalized groups. It, of course, it was critical that the governor publicly stated that as one of the goals of the administration. But then I co-chaired the commission that helped to execute that, and that we just worked on that all the time, and we reported our results. And it was a lot of learning for everybody in the system because there were many boards and commissions that had never had a person of color on their boards and had never had women on their boards. It's hard to imagine now. I
Mhm.
mean, it's really hard to imagine. The
Mhm.
young people look at me and say, really? Are you? I must be an ancient person for that to have been your reality. But and I might be an ancient person, but that's not that long ago.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And talking about that, right? I mean, you've always throughout your career you've championed women in leadership roles. You've championed those who've been underrepresented. Tell us a little bit. What was that so important to you? And where again did you pick? Where did you pick up those values? Where did those values come from? You think?
Well, growing up, there was never a question that I would go to college and have a career. I mean, my parents encouraged us not to think about getting married until we were at least 28 or 30 because they wanted us to be on our way in a career and have some traveling under our belt and all of those things. And then as I left college and was involved in starting a business, I started realizing what the societal limits were. I mean, it wasn't possible for us to get a loan for our business without the signature of my father or my partner's husband.
Wow.
Seems impossible. It seems impossible. And there were times when in once we were in business and I wasn't getting invited to certain things and a friend of mine was getting invited to things, she'd come the next day and she'd say, I didn't get invited to this. We got invited because they wanted my husband, the banker. And she, it's like when she was there, nobody was interested in her business. They were only talking to her husband. And
Mm-hmm.
so, those kinds of things. Um, and then as I was organizing in the Women's Political Caucus, one of the ways that I talked about the need for how important this was to society was that I started to believe and understand that when women were at the table, or Black folks were at the table, or other people from other ethnic groups were at the table, it was a different conversation.
Mm-hmm.
There was no question. If the conversation, and even if the conversation is all women, it's a very different conversation than if it's all men. So
Mm-hmm.
if we're trying to address society-wide problems, it's not a good thing to have only one part of society at the table. So I started talking about it in those terms. And when we started the Women Business Owners Organization, I said, we can't have our founding meeting until we have people who aren't white in our organizing group. because how we are at the beginning will be how we will be for the first 10 years. And then we'll
Mhm.
have to fix that. So we're going to fix it before we get started.
Wow.
And we did. It took, we had to postpone getting started by a couple months, but it happened. And I
Wow.
think that that's the kind of discipline that we all have to have, when our values say our outcomes will be different and will be better. That's not that we won't ever make mistakes. It's just that it will be a different conversation, and we'll approach things. We'll be richer in our understanding of society if we're more of us at the table.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that important sort of reality check for, I think, for all of us, and I do think it's something that we have to be reminded of again and
All
again,
the time. It's
all the
it's
time.
I
Yeah.
mean, intentionality in this is really important because, to be fair, most of us know most of our friends look like us.
Yes. Yes.
That's for all of us, no matter who
Yes.
we are. And
Yes.
so we have to be intentional about making sure that the group that we hang around with to work on some of these things, or most everything we work on, needs to have a more diverse look.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, and that's intentionality. It has to be intentional, otherwise it won't happen.
Yeah. No, important. So let's turn the chapter to NAFSA.
Yeah.
I mentioned that, you've left a rich legacy at NAFSA, and you and your team definitely, anytime anyone talks about NAFSA, among the myriads of things that you are known for is really setting in motion the public policy apparatus at NAFSA and really putting it on the map. So, talk to us a little bit about what are you most proud of as you think about the multiple accomplishment that you've had over your 2 decades at NAFSA. What are you most proud of?
Well, I think first of all, I need to say, Fanta, that the public policy agenda, there's no question it is a very important piece. When I was hired, the board of directors said to me, the number one, there are two priorities. One was getting the fiscal house in order, and the second one was we want a public affairs agenda that matters.
Mm,
Nobody really was clear what that meant, nor was I at that point. But they understood that we needed one and that we didn't have it.
mm,
We had a government relations program before then. So we had good relations on the Hill, but we didn't have a strategy and we weren't thinking in a larger context. And so it was it was really a lot of work to put it together. Vic Johnson was a critical person. He was a very smart hire on my part,
mm,
and I think we got a lot of things right. And it's in public policy, nothing is done. It
mm,
just because it's things are moving all the time and the players change and the issues change. Before we hired Vic, the Asia financial crisis happened, and that's how I met you actually, because you were at AU and you were one of the campus people who the press was talking to. And I called a meeting of some of the other international education organizations to say, could we figure out what we could say together here? Because the universities are in a crisis because the students' personal wealth has completely crashed and they can't afford to stay. On the other hand, the universities don't want their students to leave. And
mhm.
it was, so that was the first time NAFSA initiated a meeting to show leadership
Yes.
and start talking. That was before we had Vic Johnson. I often said to him, at least I did one smart thing before we got here. So, but it was a good start. But then we started in a more strategic way, looking at articulating the value of an international education
Hmm.
for our country. And um, there's an iteration of that still exists.
Hmm.
It was ultimately adopted by the Clinton administration because of the work of Secretary of Education Dick Riley and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and some real fancy footwork at the White House. And So I think um, it did guide everything we did because it was the frame through which other things that we worked on, other details, whether it was the Simon uh, Award or the Lincoln Commission, all of those things were pieces of the larger strategy that continued to provide the framework for what we do, and I think still does today.
Yes, absolutely. No, absolutely still does. I think that framework is still very applicable because, as you said, it is never really fully done, right? And
No, and I think one of the other important things about it was that it helped our members understand their leadership role on their campuses too. That we as a community, as a network of international educators, were speaking up on behalf of higher education about the piece that we knew better than the university presidents knew,
yes,
and that we were becoming the educators of our university and college presidents about these issues. And that had not happened before. And that is continuing to go, it's continuing as we speak. The Paul Simon Award, for instance, was part of that strategy in a program way, and that award, I believe, contributes still
yes.
to informing and educating university presidents about the importance of this, and many of them have embraced the international education strategy as an essential part of their higher education.
Mhm, mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I want to touch upon a third subject because your book talks about politics. We've talked a little bit about politics with the public policy
Yes.
leadership. The third one is love. And talk to us a little bit about the love of your life. Help
Yeah.
us understand what that means and what that meant to you.
Well, Peter was one of meeting Peter was one of those moments in which it was serendipity. I had planned a different way of spending that day, and the governor's office called and said they wanted me to take this meeting with a couple of Swedes because the governor had planned to do it, and in the last minute he couldn't. I had to change my schedule. My staff was a little grumpy about that, but I said, "Oh, it's my job to fill in when the governor can't." So I did. So that's how I met Peter. He was peripheral to the meeting. He was accompanying a client who was delivering a message from uh, Britt Mogård, who was the governor of the Kronoberg region of Sweden. And so, anyway, that's how we met. And over time, we decided to make this work, even though we understood that most of the world thought it was a little crazy. And his work, his business practice was guiding CEOs of mature companies and helping them do things in new ways. And so I had my personal built-in consultant for my work. He didn't know anything about American politics, but he enjoyed learning about it and he enjoyed helping me figure it out. Um, I had to learn to accept and really believe that when he gave me feedback, I didn't need to take his advice all the time. Sometimes initially I would get a little defensive, to be fair, and he would say, "Marlene, I am not interested in all in whether or not you take my advice. It's not important to me that you take my advice. It's only important to me that you understand my point of view."
Wow.
And that was a very different way of thinking for me, and I've I finally understood, deeply understood, that that's exactly how he felt. And then as I came out here and worked in the Clinton administration and worked at NAFSA all those years, he just loved learning about my work and giving me feedback. He loved meeting NAFSANs, the staff and the board, and coming to conferences and observing and having points of view. So I just always felt deeply supported by him,
Mm,
and I felt like I had a person who I could problem solve with in
mm,
very special ways. So it was a very special shared life we had together.
mm. Um, you know, for someone who's had a career like the one you've had, Marlene, um, where you've always, it's been always on the up and up. I mean, that's sort of how I would describe it. Um, just briefly take maybe a minute or so. That was a big loss. And you've had, you mentioned also in your book, another time, which was the sort of re-election after 8 years of being governor, a loss. A lot of times for very successful people, we don't get the opportunity to see and have insight that it is not always about winning, right?
Yeah,
There are times when there's major loss in one's life.
that's
Talk
right.
to us a little bit about that part of that chapter.
I also lost an election for mayor. So, I there are times that are not so good.
Hmm.
But I would say that in all those cases, including the tragedy with Peter that changed the last 10 years of our life together, those are special experiences too for different reasons. I mean, there's just a learning. If one can just step back for a minute and reflect, um, I feel like the uh, the losses in politics, well, they weren't at the time. They weren't great, but I understood which parts of them were my responsibility and which parts were just beyond my control, and that's important to separate those two things.
Mm.
In the time with Peter, in the end, I think that. Um, I remember saying to a physical therapist who was working with Peter at the hospital in the first couple of months, I said, of all the things that Peter and I have anticipated in how our life was going to be managing this transatlantic life we had, this kind of a tragedy never crossed our minds. And she said to me, um, we were on the neurological ward at Lund University Hospital when she was talking, and she said, Marlene, there is nobody among the 35 patients on this ward right now who ever anticipated being here.
Mm.
And that's a really good thing, because if one anticipated being here, you couldn't get up in the morning. This is the kind of situation where um, each person deals with it in their own way because it's their new reality, and they find the strength, and you will find the strength, and you are finding the strength to do it, and you will keep learning things about yourself. And that is what happened. And so on a personal basis, I learned about a caregiving role I did not know I was capable of. If you had told me 6 months earlier that I would have that role, I wouldn't have believed it, and I wouldn't have believed I could do it. If you had told me I would learn how to be a remote worker, I mean, now remote work is common. But when I was working from Sweden 1 week a month with the NAFSA board's support and the incredible support of a management team,
Mhm.
uh, I would, I mean, we made it work.
Yeah.
And we made it work in a way that was almost normal. I mean, it wasn't as quite as normal as it is today. But today, it is the way things are. I mean, it is. I mean, just yesterday, I talked to a friend whose daughter is an executive at a major technology company, and she's going to start working from France 2 weeks of the month. So it's this is now the new normal. But when I was doing it, it was not done, and it was because of the generosity of the NAFSA board and the management team I had here that made it possible for me to do it. And I'm very grateful for that.
You know, the book again, for all of our colleagues who are listening, many have known you in lots of capacities, but I can assure you, I learned so much more about you, Marlene, and your life overall. And the part that keeps coming back to me as I sort of think about it is how many first
Yeah.
you've had in your life, right? First lieutenant governor, Sort of first to have taken the role at NAFSA that was not your sort of your conventional international educator, and that set in motion a course around public policy that today we continue to sort of benefit from. I'm
Yes,
hearing from you sort of first at that time thinking about remote work,
exactly.
work as sort of how we create a humanity for folks who are working, and figuring out ways to make it work when you have a strong team, and people understand that that is not so far-fetched in all of those pieces.
Right.
And then also just the business that you had when you were in Minnesota, a lot of first, that you've encountered. My last question, to you is this: you've written this book, congratulations, kudos on it.
Thank you.
And for anyone that I see Sinem and others saying they've ordered the book, Jason and everybody, um, and Sora and others indicating that they're gonna, if they haven't ordered the book, they're gonna order the book. Um, I almost feel like there's still another story to be written, and you're saying to me, "Oh my goodness, I'm just trying to get this one out," and you're telling me there's another one. So I want to finish with this question to you.
Okay.
In a book, you have to select what you're going to put in, because one's life is so wholesome and there's so much to be told. So as you kind of reflect now that the book is really just hot off the press, is here, um, what if you were to write a second chapter to this? What would be one thing
Oh
that you
my
want to
God.
make sure is in there?
Just for the audience to know, this is not one of the questions she gave me in advance.
No, not.
This is a surprise question.
Yes.
I don't know. It is true that I miss writing. I
Mm,
was for almost a year and a half, closer to 2 years. I was writing 6 days a week, and
mm,
some days only an hour, and some days 4 hours. And I loved it, and I miss the writing because now I've been working on promoting the book. So
mm,
um, I have I have thought about if there's something else to write, and one of the things that I didn't write very much about is the work that I've done as a volunteer board member.
mm,
I've I have been on many boards of nonprofits, small ones and large ones, both in Minnesota and since I've been out here. And it's been a really important part of my life, and I've learned a lot from it. When I was an entrepreneur, those nonprofit boards were where I met business leaders and where I learned about leadership issues from another perspective, which I wouldn't have gotten at work because I worked with two or three other people instead of large organizations. So it was where I met corporate leaders in Minnesota initially, and since I've been out here, it's been a very different, broader experience as I've served on the board of Kenya's Dream, the School for Girls in Kenya, and the board of Working Opportunities for Women. WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America, and at some point I was on the board of the Girl Scouts of the nation's capital. So those experiences have been really important to me, and I didn't write about them in the book. So I don't know if there's a book there or not, but I know that I want to write some more, and we'll have to see what happens. If there's enough interest in this book, then we'll see.
what an incredible way to finish our conversation today, Marlene, because you know your comment about if you were to write a second book, what it would be, I think is emblematic of what you've done throughout your journey and your career, and that is to be of service. And this once more is an illustration of just how much service is so part of your DNA. Thank you first and foremost. I would be remiss if I didn't thank you for the incredible contributions you've made to NAFSA and to the field, over those many decades, that has allowed us to continue this work in more meaningful way. And you will see, through the comments, that there are many NAFSANs who are part of the conversation today who are immensely grateful. So thank you for that. And I'm really excited that the book is out. And for those who are looking to sort of get your hands on it, it is already out. And I know that if I understand correctly, you will also be doing hopefully some book readings and others. So I would say definitely go to the website, and make sure that you're keeping track of where Marlene is going to be, because before you know it, she may be in a city near you as well.
Thank you.
But more than anything else, thank you for sharing your incredible story with us. Thank you for the many first, that I think will, has inspired generations of women and others to really see leadership as something that is not only doable, but something that really can lead to just so much more. Very much appreciate that. And to those who've joined us today, thank you for making time for this noontime. And I'm sure, as I said before, this will not be the last you've heard about this book. It is definitely really just it was wonderful to have an opportunity to delve into it and to learn so much more about your career and the contributions that you've made in so many sectors. Thank you again, Marlene.
Thank
Thank
you, Fanta. It's been great visiting with you. Thanks.
thank you.